There is a door at the end of a corridor that has not seen daylight in 3,000 years. The stone around it is thick enough to swallow sound. The air inside barely moves. It is not the still air of a room left empty, but the dense, pressurized stillness of a place that was deliberately sealed. Whoever sealed it did not do so in haste. They worked slowly, carefully, with the calm of people who understood exactly what they were doing and why. And when they were finished, they left no key behind. Not because they forgot, because they never intended for it to be opened again. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself standing at that threshold. Not as a tourist, not as a researcher with a flashlight and a notebook, but as someone who has wandered in from the desert, drawn by something they cannot name. The sand outside is hot. In here, the temperature drops sharply, the way temperature drops when you descend into something ancient and underground. The smell is stone and time and something faintly organic that you cannot identify. The darkness ahead of you is not the darkness of a room with the lights off. It is a different quality of dark. Thick, intentional, almost intelligent. You take one step forward, and the sound of the world behind you disappears. Not gradually, all at once. This is what the people who built these places wanted you to feel, not fear exactly. Though fear is part of it, something older than fear. The awareness that you are standing at the edge of something that was not made for you, was not made for ordinary human beings at all, was made for a specific kind of person who had spent years preparing to cross exactly this kind of threshold. People died protecting what lay beyond this door, not metaphorically, literally. There are records, carved in stone, pressed into clay, inked on papyrus, of individuals executed for revealing what took place in rooms exactly like this one. The punishment was not imprisonment. It was not exile. The punishment was death, and it was applied without hesitation, because the people in charge of this knowledge believed, with absolute, unshakable certainty, that what they were protecting was worth more than any individual life. What could possibly be worth that? The modern world has a complicated relationship with secrets. We distrust them. We build institutions dedicated to uncovering them. We pass laws that punish the keeping of them when they belong to governments, corporations, or anyone with power over others. And yet something about the word still pulls at us. The idea that somewhere, behind some closed door, there is information that would change everything we think we know. The ancient world had a completely different understanding. In Egypt, the word for secret and the word for sacred shared the same root. This was not a coincidence. It was a philosophy. A thing that was hidden was, by definition, a thing that was holy. The goddess Seshat, divine keeper of records and patron of all temple archives, bore a specific title that translates most accurately as she of the hidden things. The priests who served under her patronage understood that knowledge existed on a spectrum. There was ordinary knowledge, the kind that anyone could hold, pass around, trade, forget. And then there was another category of knowledge entirely. Knowledge that was alive. Knowledge that did not merely describe the world, but when handled correctly, could alter it. In Greece, the word was aporeta. It meant, literally, things that must not be spoken. For nearly 2,000 years, this single word governed one of the most consequential institutions in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Eleusinian mysteries, a set of rituals performed outside Athens that every significant thinker, military leader, and philosopher of the age underwent. Plato attended, Aristotle attended, Cicero attended, and every one of them, when they later sat down to write about truth, beauty, the soul, the nature of reality, every one of them reached for language that suggested they were describing something they had personally experienced, not merely something they had reasoned their way to. But none of them wrote down what happened inside. They were not being coy. They were being precise. Because the experience, they said, could not be transmitted in words. It had to be lived. In the Vedic tradition of ancient India, the concept was Gupta Vidya, hidden knowledge, and it carried a warning that sounds extreme until you understand its logic. Sacred formulae, the texts insisted, spoken aloud to someone who had not been prepared to receive them, could cause real harm. Not symbolic harm, physical harm, to both the speaker and the listener. The sound itself, in the wrong context, in the wrong configuration, in the wrong mouth, was dangerous. Now a modern person reads this and thinks, superstition, ancient people trying to explain a frightening world. But consider the logic from the inside. When you have spent 30 years refining a body of knowledge that took your predecessors thousands of years to develop, when you have seen what happens to people who approach that knowledge incorrectly, unprepared, without the proper framework, you develop a profound respect for the conditions under which it can safely be transmitted. The priests were not hiding their secrets out of ego or power hunger, though power was certainly a consequence. They were hiding them because they had learned, empirically, that some things break people who are not ready for them. The secret, in other words, was protected not from the world, but for it. Before we descend into the chambers themselves, we need to understand the scale of what we are dealing with. Because this is not a story about one civilization, one religion, or one peculiar tradition at the margins of history. This is a story that appears, independently, consistently, with unsettling precision, across 6 distinct civilizations that had no meaningful contact with each other. And when the same story appears in 6 different languages, in 6 different parts of the world, across thousands of years of separation, that is no longer a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns, in the language of history, are the closest thing we have to proof. Ancient Egypt. At its height, Egyptian priestly culture maintained sacred inner chambers, so restricted that the priests who served in the outer courts of the same temple might spend their entire careers never setting foot inside them. One priest in a specific lineage spent, by documented account, 10 years in a state of ritual silence before being considered prepared to speak a single sacred word aloud within the inner sanctum. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, home to Sumer and Babylon and Assyria, the oldest urban civilization the world has yet identified. At the top of their great ziggurats, those step towers that rose above the flat plains like artificial mountains, was a chamber accessible to exactly one person. Not the king, the high priest, and only on one specific night of the year. Ancient Greece. The mysteries at Eleusis ran continuously for nearly 2,000 years. Every major figure in the history of Western thought was initiated. Not one of them described what happened inside. Plato wrote around it his whole life. His description of the highest reality. That cave, that light, that moment of turning toward the sun. is almost certainly a metaphor for something he actually experienced. But the experience itself, sealed. The Vedic tradition of ancient India, a priestly class called the Brahmins, maintained a curriculum of training so rigorous that modern scholars who have tried to calculate how long it would take to memorize the primary texts using average adult learning rates arrived at estimates of 40 years or more. The Brahmins accomplished this in 12, because they began before the age of 5. Because they understood something about the human brain's capacity for language that modern neuroscientists only confirmed in the 20th century. The Maya and Aztec civilizations of Mesoamerica, whose priestly class maintained ritual chambers and astronomical archives of a sophistication that continues to astonish researchers today. In 1952, a sealed chamber was discovered beneath the pyramid of the inscriptions at Palenque. Filled with offerings, inscriptions, and a single sarcophagus of extraordinary beauty. The chamber had been sealed for over 1,000 years. What was it for? Scholars are still not entirely certain. And the Druids of the Celtic world, a class of men and women who spent up to 20 years memorizing a body of knowledge they refused, specifically and deliberately, to commit to writing. Writing was available to them. They chose not to use it. They believed, correctly as it turned out, that a living human mind was a safer archive than any material surface. 6 civilizations, 1 pattern. And the question that connects them all is the same. What did they know that was worth protecting so carefully? There is a version of this story that has been told before. It usually involves dramatic music, grainy photographs of pyramids, and a narrator who speaks with the breathless certainty of someone who has already decided what the answer is. That is not the story we are telling here. What we are telling is harder and stranger than any conspiracy, because it is real. It is documented. It is sitting in archives and museum basements and peer-reviewed journals, waiting for someone to read it in the right order and notice what it adds up to. Here is what you will discover over the course of this journey. You will discover that the chambers themselves, the rooms, the walls, the acoustics, the air, were not simply locations for ritual. They were instruments, engineered environments designed to do something specific to the human body and the human mind. You will discover that the priests who entered these rooms were not simply holy men with a gift for prayer. They were highly trained specialists who had spent years, sometimes decades, preparing their bodies and minds for a very specific kind of work. Work that modern neuroscience is only now finding the vocabulary to describe. You will discover that the practices performed inside these chambers, the sounds, the substances, the silence, the specific quality of darkness, were not superstitious fumbling in the direction of invisible gods. They were applications of knowledge. Knowledge about how the human nervous system works. Knowledge about what happens to the mind when you remove ordinary stimulation and replace it with something deliberate, controlled, and ancient. And at the very end, after all the evidence has been laid out with the patience it deserves, you will arrive at the question that none of the ancient texts ever directly answers, but that all of them, in their own ways, seem to be pointing toward. A question about what we are, about what we are capable of perceiving, about what the most carefully prepared human beings in history believed was waiting on the other side of the threshold they spent their lives approaching. The door has been sealed for a very long time. But doors, if you understand how they were built, can sometimes be opened from the outside. All you need is the right key. And the key, it turns out, is the story itself. There is a chamber in Ireland that is older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids at Giza, older than almost any structure still standing on the surface of this planet. It was built roughly 5,000 years ago by people who had no written language, no metal tools, and no understanding of physics as we would define it. And yet when modern acoustic engineers entered this chamber and measured its resonant properties, running tones through it, mapping the frequencies that the stone walls amplified and reflected, they found something that should not have been possible. The chamber at Newgrange is tuned. Not in the way a room is accidentally tuned by the shape of its walls, deliberately, precisely tuned to resonate most powerfully at a specific frequency, approximately 110 Hz. A low drone, the sound of a human voice pitched below ordinary speech, sustained without variation. And when modern researchers exposed human subjects to sustained tones at this exact frequency, measuring their brainwave activity with electroencephalography, they found consistent, reproducible shifts in neural oscillation, a reduction of activity in the left hemisphere, an increase in the right, a loosening of the mental architecture that usually keeps experience tightly organized, bounded, logical, and linear. The people who built Newgrange did not know what an electroencephalogram was. They did not have a word for hemispheric lateralization. What they had was the product of many generations of careful observation. They had noticed, probably over centuries, possibly over millennia, that specific sounds produced in specific spaces reliably produced specific changes in the people inside them. And they built their most sacred space to maximize that effect. This is the first thing to understand about ancient sacred chambers. They were not simply rooms, they were instruments. Every dimension was chosen, every surface was considered. The ancient architects were not decorating a space for a god. They were engineering an environment for a human being. The god was the justification. The human being was the machine they were tuning. In Egypt, the inner sanctums of great temples followed a deliberate architectural sequence that modern psychologists, had they been consulted, would immediately recognize as a preparation protocol. You entered first through a vast outer courtyard, open to the sky, flooded with Egyptian light, wide enough to hold thousands of people. Then the outer hall, still large, but the columns brought the ceiling down, created shadows, reduced the sense of open space. Then a narrower hall, then an antechamber, then the innermost room. The naos, the Holy of Holies, often barely large enough for two people to stand in, with no windows and no source of natural light whatsoever. The journey from the courtyard to the naos was a journey from ordinary consciousness to something else, from the familiar, sun-drenched world of daily life into increasingly compressed, dark, enclosed space. The human nervous system does not pass through this sequence without responding. Vulnerability rises, sensory acuity sharpens. The ordinary mental chatter that occupies most of waking life begins gradually to quiet. By the time a person reached the innermost room, their body had already done much of the work of preparation. The architecture had seen to it. This was not accidental. It was craft. On the 22nd of February and again on the 22nd of October, something happens at the temple of Abu Simbel in southern Egypt. A beam of sunlight enters the temple at dawn and travels, without touching the walls, down a corridor 200 feet long and 40 feet deep into solid rock. At the end of that corridor, the light strikes the face of a seated figure, Ramesses II, deified, and illuminates it for approximately 4 minutes before moving on. Beside him, in that innermost chamber, sit 3 other figures. One of them, representing Ptah, the god of the underworld, remains permanently in shadow. The alignment was engineered in the 13th century BCE. 3,000 years later, it still works. Think about what this required. Not just engineering skill, not just astronomical knowledge, both of which are extraordinary enough, but a specific intention. Someone decided, with great care and great deliberation, that on these 2 specific days, at this specific hour, sunlight would touch this specific face and leave that specific face in permanent darkness. This was a theological statement made in stone and light. The medium was not paint or text. It was the sun itself, conscripted into service. And this was not the only example. At Karnak, the axis of the great temple complex aligns so that on the winter solstice, the setting sun sends a single slant of light directly through the hypostyle hall and into the inner sanctum, touching, for just a few minutes, the statue of the god at the center of the shrine. Modern visitors who have witnessed this describe the effect as overwhelming. A physical sensation of significance that operates below the level of conscious thought, triggering something in the body that does not require belief to function. But the more you study ancient sacred architecture, the more you realize that light and darkness were deployed with equal intentionality, and that darkness may have been the more powerful tool. Many sacred chambers were not designed to receive light at specific moments. They were designed to eliminate it entirely. Buried deep beneath ground level, oriented away from every possible source of natural illumination, painted black, sealed against even the faint intrusion of starlight. These were spaces of absolute dark. In the ancient priestly tradition, total darkness was not an absence, it was a presence. The most sacred things live in the dark, not because the priests feared light, but because they understood something about the human mind in a state of complete visual deprivation. Within 30 minutes of entering total darkness, the brain begins to generate its own light. Phosphines, hypnagogic imagery, the first tentative edges of internally produced vision. The ancient priests did not have the vocabulary of neuroscience, but they had catalogued the stages of this process with extraordinary precision. They knew what a person would begin to see at the 4-hour mark, at the 12-hour mark, at the 3-day mark. And they built rooms designed to let it happen, undisturbed, in exactly the right conditions. In 220, a team of researchers published a study in an international archaeology journal that briefly made headlines in academic circles before being largely ignored by mainstream media. The researchers had analyzed residue from incense burners found at an ancient Judean sanctuary, a place of worship dating to the 8th century before the Common Era. In those burners, alongside frankincense, they found something unexpected: cannabis, not trace amounts, enough to produce measurable psychoactive effects in anyone present in the enclosed sanctuary tomb during the burning. This was not a counterculture discovery. It was chemistry applied to archaeology, and it immediately raised a question that the researchers themselves acknowledged. Was this an accident, or was it intentional? The answer, when you begin to look at the broader picture of ancient ritual incense across multiple civilizations, becomes difficult to avoid. It was intentional, systematically, consistently, carefully intentional. In Egypt, the sacred incense known as kefi was one of the most precisely documented preparations in the ancient world. Its recipe was inscribed on the walls of the temples at Edfu and Philae. Not as a secret, but as a matter of official record, a formula so important that it was carved in stone. It contained 16 ingredients: honey, wine, raisins, juniper, pine resin, cyperus, aromatic woods, and several other compounds whose exact identities have been partially lost. When modern pharmacologists analyzed kefi's composition and studied what these compounds produce when burned together in an enclosed space, they found something remarkable. Several of the ingredients, in combination, produce compounds in the beta-carboline alkaloid family. Beta-carboline alkaloids are the same class of chemicals that make ayahuasca work. Specifically, they are the compounds that slow the body's breakdown of other active substances, extending and amplifying their effects. The ancient Egyptian priests were not accidentally stumbling upon mild relaxants. They were formulating, through accumulated experimental knowledge, a substance that would reliably produce specific effects in a specific environment. In Mesoamerica, copal resin was the central ritual incense of every major civilization: Olmec, Maya, Aztec, and others. Modern analysis of copal smoke has identified incensyl acetate as one of its primary active compounds. Incensyl acetate has been confirmed in peer-reviewed research to produce measurable anxiolytic effects, reduction of anxiety, and to produce changes in emotional processing that researchers describe as consistent with enhanced states of openness and receptivity. In other words, copal smoke did not merely smell sacred. It chemically prepared the people breathing it to be more open to the kind of experience the ritual was designed to produce. But here is the detail that stops the room. One specific compound found in the residue of ancient Egyptian ritual contexts shares its molecular structure with a substance that, as of the past decade, is being evaluated in Phase 2 clinical trials in the United States as a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. A compound that modern medicine is only now learning to use precisely. Ancient priests appear to have been using a functional equivalent of it in controlled ritual contexts for at least 3,000 years. This does not mean they knew everything. It means they knew more than we assumed. And it means that the sacred smoke that filled these chambers was not theater. It was chemistry. If you take a map of the ancient world and mark every major sacred site, every oracle, every mystery school, every underground temple complex, every holy cave, and then overlay it with a geological map of fault lines, underground aquifers, and mineral deposits known to produce electromagnetic or chemical anomalies, something begins to emerge from the data that modern researchers have struggled to explain away. They cluster, not randomly, with a consistency that is difficult to attribute to chance. The oracle at Delphi, the most influential religious site in the ancient Mediterranean world, sat above the intersection of two geological fault lines. For centuries, classical scholars dismissed the ancient accounts of vapors rising from a chasm beneath the oracle's chamber as mythological embellishment. Then, in the 1990s, a team of geologists and archaeologists revisited the site and discovered something the ancients had known all along. The fault lines beneath Delphi periodically release ethylene gas, a hydrocarbon with mild psychoactive properties, capable of producing states of altered awareness and emotional openness in someone exposed to low concentrations in an enclosed space. The oracle's experience was not supernatural. It was geological. But it was real, and the priests of Delphi had found it, understood it, and built an institution around it that endured for 1,000 years. In Malta, the Hypogeum is an underground temple complex carved entirely from limestone, beginning around 3600 BCE. Its builders created a network of chambers that descend through 3 levels, each deeper and more enclosed than the last. Acoustic engineers who have studied the lowest chamber have measured effects on human brainwave patterns in test subjects who spend time there. Effects consistent with heightened suggestibility and enhanced emotional processing. The site was in continuous use for centuries. Something about it worked. In Ireland, the great Neolithic monuments cluster along specific geological formations in ways that are not yet fully understood, but are consistently observed. Sacred wells, long associated with healing and vision, reliably appear above specific underground water sources whose chemical and electromagnetic properties continue to interest researchers. The priests of the ancient world were not geologists, but they were empiricists. They had discovered, through long observation, through the testimony of generations of people who had sat in these places and reported what happened to them, that specific locations on the Earth's surface produced specific, reliable effects on the human mind. And they built their most sacred structures directly on top of those locations. And they kept the reason why a closely guarded secret, because the reason was also an instruction, and instructions in the wrong hands have always been dangerous. There is a moment in the historical record of ancient Egypt, around 1080 BCE, during what scholars call the Third Intermediate Period, when something extraordinary becomes visible in the accounting ledgers of the state. The temple of Amun at Karnak, which had been accumulating wealth and land for centuries, had grown to control approximately 1/3 of all cultivated land in Egypt. Not temple land, not sacred land in some loose ceremonial sense. Arable, productive, economically significant agricultural land. The temple also owned a fleet of ships. It operated a treasury that in certain years received more revenue than the royal household. It commanded its own private security force. And the man who administered all of this was not a general, not an appointed official of the state, not a member of the royal family. He was the high priest of Amun. At a specific and documented moment during this period, the high priest Herihor went further than administration. He took the royal cartouche, the oval hieroglyphic border that enclosed the name of a living god-king, and placed his own name inside it. In the inscriptions at the temple of Khons in Karnak, he appears in relief carvings occupying the position traditionally reserved for Pharaoh. He never formally claimed the throne. He did not need to. He simply made himself, in the visual and theological language of Egyptian civilization, indistinguishable from the ruler of the known world. He had not fought for this. He had not married into it. He had administered his way to it, through a process that took generations and operated entirely through the management of sacred ritual and the theological architecture that made ritual monopoly the most powerful form of political currency in the ancient world. This is the single most important thing to understand about ancient priesthoods, before you can understand what they actually did in their secret chambers. They were not primarily spiritual institutions. They were, first and foremost, institutions of concentrated power. And the mechanism through which they concentrated power was not violence or deception. It was genuine theological authority, built over centuries into the foundations of civilization. In Mesopotamia, the priests of Marduk in Babylon controlled the city's granaries, its water distribution, its record-keeping, and its calendar. In Vedic India, the Brahmin priestly class occupied a position in the social hierarchy so elevated that even kings were required, for the most significant state ceremonies, to submit to priestly authority. Among the Maya, the priestly class held exclusive authority over the long count calendar. The most sophisticated astronomical and mathematical system developed in the ancient Americas, and therefore held in a very practical sense exclusive authority over time itself. When you control the calendar, you control when to plant and harvest. When you control harvest, you control survival. When you control survival, you control everything. The secret chambers at the center of all these traditions were not simply where priests went to commune with their gods. They were where the source of priestly power was maintained, renewed, and kept hidden from everyone who did not need to understand it. In Egypt, in the middle years of the New Kingdom, a sacred bull was born in a stable somewhere in the Nile Delta. It was not an ordinary bull. Its mother had been struck by lightning at the moment of conception, or so the tradition required. Its hide displayed a specific sequence of markings: a white diamond on the forehead, a crescent on the right flank, a scarab-shaped mark under the tongue, a double tuft of hair on the tail. The probability of any individual bull displaying all of these markings simultaneously was extremely small. Finding one could take years of searching across the entire agricultural population of Egypt. When a bull with all the required markings was found, it was examined by a panel of priests, confirmed, transported with enormous ceremony to the Temple of Ptah at Memphis, and there, for the rest of its natural life, it was understood to be the living body of a god. This process, the Apis bull selection, sounds, to modern ears, like elaborate theatre, but consider it for a moment as a technology. The priests who developed the marking criteria, refined over centuries, were creating a selection system that operated across the entire country without requiring any central coordination, and that produced, at unpredictable intervals, a focal point for national spiritual attention. The animal selected was verifiably unusual. Its unusual appearance was documented. Its arrival was an event, and its presence in the temple renewed. Automatically and continuously, the authority of the priests who managed it. Nearly identical logic governs the selection of the Dalai Lama, a process developed independently in Tibet thousands of years later. A child displays specific signs, is tested against specific criteria, passes through a selection process managed by trained specialists, and emerges as a confirmed sacred figure. The two systems, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, are structurally identical because they are solving the same problem. The Greeks, faced with the question of who would speak for Apollo at Delphi, arrived at a different solution. The Pythia, the oracle, was initially required to be a young virgin from the local village. After an incident in which a young Pythia was reportedly abducted following her pronouncements, the rules were changed. Thereafter, the oracle was always an older woman, typically a widow of peasant birth and blameless reputation. The selection criteria appear simple, but they were not arbitrary. An older woman of peasant origin had no political allegiances, no dynastic ambitions, no wealthy family whose interests she might serve. She was, in the ancient Greek estimation, as close to a politically neutral mouthpiece as a human being could be. The Vedic selection system was the most rigorous of all, and the most biologically sophisticated. Brahmin children identified for priestly training began their education before the age of 5. The reason was not tradition alone. It was neuroscience, applied 3,000 years before the field existed. The human brain's window of maximum language acquisition, the period during which new sound systems, grammatical structures, and memorization patterns are absorbed with the least effort, closes gradually between the ages of 5 and 12. A child who begins memorizing Vedic hymns at 4 experiences the neural encoding of those sounds as something close to first language acquisition. By the time their contemporaries were learning to read, these children had already internalized tens of thousands of lines of text that the average adult could not have memorized in a decade of dedicated effort. Every morning, before dawn, a group of priests in the temple complex at Karnak rose from their sleeping quarters and made their way to a shallow ceremonial pool. They washed themselves, not in the casual way of daily hygiene, but in a specific ritual sequence, with specific prayers attached to specific actions. Then they shaved. Not their faces, their entire bodies, head, eyebrows, and all body hair, removed every 3 days. This had been the practice for as long as anyone could remember. It would continue for as long as the civilization lasted. For the rest of the day, they were forbidden from eating fish, from eating beans, from eating garlic. They could not wear wool, linen only, always white. They could not share a meal with someone from outside the priestly caste. They could not sleep in a bed that a non-priest had occupied. Every element of their daily life existed on the far side of a boundary that separated them, visibly and continuously, from the ordinary world outside the temple walls. These rules have been described in most popular accounts of Egyptian religion as ritual purity requirements. But purity is a secondary consequence. The primary function is identity. What the Wab priests of Egypt were doing, through the shaving, the diet restrictions, the fabric requirements, the washing, was constructing every single day a version of themselves that was visibly, undeniably, unmistakably different from any other human being alive. A priest without hair looks like no one in particular. A priest who cannot eat the food of ordinary people cannot fully participate in ordinary life. A priest who washes himself 4 times daily in ceremonial water is reminded 4 times daily of the boundary around his existence. The purpose was not cleanliness. The purpose was the continuous, embodied enactment of a different kind of humanity. In Rome, the priests of the goddess Cybele, a tradition imported from Asia Minor that became one of the most striking and most misunderstood in the Roman world, offered something that could not be taken back. During their initiation, in a state that ancient sources describe as one of ecstatic divine possession, the Galli, as these priests were called, performed ritual self-castration. Roman observers recorded this with a mixture of horror and awe. Later Christian and secular commentators dismissed it as fanaticism, as mental illness, as the cruelty of primitive religion. But the ancient theological logic was precise. The galley had surrendered the biological marker that, more than any other in the ancient world, defined a man as a man. In doing so, they had stepped outside the categories that organized ordinary human experience, male and female, capable and incapable of ordinary domestic life. They had become something the ancient world had a specific word for, a person who had passed beyond the normal boundaries of humanity and now occupied a threshold between the human and the divine. They were not men. They were not women. They were something the goddess had made specifically for herself. To say this was fanaticism is to miss the point entirely. It was identity architecture at its most extreme, and the extreme was the point. Every morning, before dawn, a group of priests in the temple complex at Karnak rose from their sleeping quarters and made their way to a shallow ceremonial pool. They washed themselves, not in the casual way of daily hygiene, but in a specific ritual sequence, with specific prayers attached to specific actions. Then they shaved. Not their faces, their entire bodies, head, eyebrows, and all body hair, removed every 3 days. This had been the practice for as long as anyone could remember. It would continue for as long as the civilization lasted. For the rest of the day, they were forbidden from eating fish, from eating beans, from eating garlic. They could not wear wool. Linen only, always white. They could not share a meal with someone from outside the priestly caste. They could not sleep in a bed that a non-priest had occupied. Every element of their daily life existed on the far side of a boundary that separated them, visibly and continuously, from the ordinary world outside the temple walls. These rules have been described, in most popular accounts of Egyptian religion, as ritual purity requirements. But purity is a secondary consequence. The primary function is identity. What the Wab priests of Egypt were doing, through the shaving, the diet restrictions, the fabric requirements, the washing, was constructing, every single day, a version of themselves that was visibly, undeniably, unmistakably different from any other human being alive. A priest without hair looks like no one in particular. A priest who cannot eat the food of ordinary people cannot fully participate in ordinary life. A priest who washes himself 4 times daily in ceremonial water is reminded, 4 times daily, of the boundary around his existence. The purpose was not cleanliness. The purpose was the continuous, embodied enactment of a different kind of humanity. In Rome, the priests of the goddess Cybele, a tradition imported from Asia Minor that became one of the most striking and most misunderstood in the Roman world, offered something that could not be taken back. During their initiation, in a state that ancient sources describe as one of ecstatic divine possession, the Geli, as these priests were called, performed ritual self-castration. Roman observers recorded this with a mixture of horror and awe. Later, Christian and secular commentators dismissed it as fanaticism, as mental illness, as the cruelty of primitive religion. But the ancient theological logic was precise. The Galley had surrendered the biological marker that more than any other in the ancient world defined a man as a man. In doing so, they had stepped outside the categories that organized ordinary human experience, male and female, capable and incapable of ordinary domestic life. They had become something the ancient world had a specific word for, a person who had passed beyond the normal boundaries of humanity and now occupied a threshold between the human and the divine. They were not men. They were not women. They were something the goddess had made specifically for herself. To say this was fanaticism is to miss the point entirely. It was identity architecture at its most extreme, and the extreme was the point. In 1901, a Greek sponge diver working off the island of Antikythera found a shipwreck on the seafloor. Among the objects recovered from the wreck was a corroded lump of bronze that sat in the Athens National Museum for decades, largely ignored, before anyone understood what it was. When it was finally cleaned and analyzed with the technology available in the late 20th century, researchers discovered something that remains one of the most startling archaeological finds in modern history. The object was a mechanical computer. It accurately calculated the positions of the sun, moon, and 5 known planets. It predicted solar and lunar eclipses. It tracked the 4-year Olympic cycle and the 19-year metonic cycle of lunar phases. It had been constructed around 100 BCE by Greek craftsmen, using a system of interlocking gears of extraordinary precision. It would not be surpassed by Western technology. For over 1,000 years, the Antikythera mechanism was not made by priests. But it demonstrates, in hard metal, the level of astronomical and mathematical sophistication that existed in the ancient world. The priestly traditions of Egypt and Mesopotamia were working with the same level of sophistication, or, in many cases, had been working with it for far longer. The astronomical records maintained by Babylonian temple priests are so accurate, so consistent, and so extensive that modern astronomers have used them to calibrate historical eclipse calculations. These records were not made by passive skywatchers with nothing else to do. They were made by a professional class of specialists who understood that the sky was a text, and that reading it correctly had consequences for everything from agriculture to warfare to the management of royal succession. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world, dates to approximately 1600 BCE, but is almost certainly based on priestly medical traditions that are significantly older. It describes 48 clinical cases, injuries ranging from skull fractures to chest wounds, with an attention to symptom description, differential diagnosis, and treatment recommendation that reads, in translation, as surprisingly rational and empirically grounded. Case 6 famously describes a brain injury with specific symptoms: loss of speech, paralysis of the limbs on the opposite side from the injury, and correctly identifies the relationship between the site of injury and the location of the resulting deficit. The concept of cerebral lateralization was not formally articulated in Western medicine until the 19th century. Egyptian priests were documenting it clinically 2,500 years earlier. The knowledge held by ancient priestly traditions was not a collection of myths masquerading as science. It was science, gathered through observation, tested through application, refined through repetition, and transmitted through training. Conducted in the vocabulary and conceptual framework of its time. The sacred chamber was where this knowledge was applied at its highest level. Understanding what the priests knew before we enter those chambers changes everything about what we see when we arrive there. Julius Caesar, writing about the Druids during his campaigns in Gaul, noted with a mixture of curiosity and impatience that these priests spent up to 20 years in training, during which they committed to memory a great number of verses. He did not linger on the detail. He was not particularly interested in the mechanics of Druidic education. He was interested in its political consequences, specifically in the fact that the Druid class was exempt from military service and taxation, which gave them considerable social leverage. But the detail he mentioned in passing, the 20 years, the verses, is one of the most significant facts in the history of human knowledge management. Modern Celtic scholars, working backward from the medieval Irish literature that almost certainly preserves genuine pre-Christian Druidic material, have attempted to estimate the volume of material that these 20-year training programs required candidates to memorize. The estimates vary. None of them are small. The consensus range falls somewhere between 100,000 and 400,000 lines of verse. In a tradition that deliberately, specifically chose not to write any of it down, because writing, the Druids believed, weakened the mind that relied on it and exposed the knowledge to people who had not earned the right to hold it. This was not ignorance of writing. Caesar himself noted that the Druids used the Greek alphabet for commercial and administrative purposes. They wrote down their accounts, their correspondence, their records. They simply refused to write down the thing that mattered most. And they were right to do so for reasons that go beyond the mystical and into the profoundly practical. Consider what has survived. Every major ancient tradition that relied primarily on writing has suffered catastrophic textual loss. The Library of Alexandria is the famous example, but it is one instance of a pattern that repeats across every ancient civilization. Clay tablets crack, papyrus rots, wood burns, parchment deteriorates. Physical archives are vulnerable to everything: fire, flood, war, neglect, political suppression. The Druidic archive was destroyed when the Roman general Suetonius Paulinus massacred the priestly community on the island of Anglesey in 60 CE. But destroyed in this context means something specific. The living human beings who carried the knowledge were killed. The knowledge died with them. It was not in a building that could be burned. It was in people who could be killed. And yet the Vedic oral tradition, which faced comparable pressures from conquest, persecution, and cultural disruption over 3,000 years, survived. Not despite its oral nature, but because of it. The redundancy built into the transmission system. Dozens of independent practitioners, trained independently, carrying the same material, made it almost impossible to eradicate. You would have had to kill every trained Vedic priest simultaneously in every part of the Indian subcontinent. No invader ever managed that. Today, when researchers record Vedic chanting performances by practitioners trained in different regions who have had no contact with each other, the variance between the performances is measured in fractions of a percent. The oral archive is more accurate than most manuscript traditions, because the living mind, properly trained, is a more faithful medium than any material surface. At the temple of Hathor at Dendera in Egypt, the ceilings of the innermost chambers bear one of the most extraordinary works of ancient astronomy ever created. The so-called Dendera zodiac, now held in the Louvre in Paris, replaced in the original location by a plaster cast, is a circular bas-relief depicting the celestial sky with the constellations arranged in their correct relative positions. When 19th century researchers first analyzed it, they were able to use the positions of the planets shown in the relief to calculate the specific date on which the sky appeared in this configuration. It was a sky map, a snapshot of a particular moment in time, carved in stone with enough precision to allow modern astronomers to verify its accuracy. But the ceiling is not simply a calendar. The specific moment it records, the specific arrangement of celestial bodies it preserves, corresponds to a ritual date in the Egyptian sacred calendar. The date of a specific ceremony performed in that specific temple. The ceiling is a record of when the most sacred ritual in that temple's annual cycle took place. And it is encoded in astronomical imagery, in a medium that would survive the collapse of the civilization that made it. Accessible to anyone who understood the language of the sky. This is the pattern that appears across ancient temple iconography when you look for it. The walls are not merely decorated. They are encoded. They contain information in multiple registers simultaneously. Mythological narrative on the surface. Astronomical data in the spatial relationships between figures. Ritual instruction in the sequence of images. Pharmacological knowledge in the specific plants and animals that appear in specific contexts. In Babylon, cylinder seals. Small stone cylinders, used to roll impressions into clay, depicted mythological scenes in compositions that researchers have increasingly recognized as encoding celestial information. The relationship between specific figures in specific seals corresponds to the relative positions of planets at specific times of year. Reading these seals as astronomy rather than mythology produces results that are startlingly coherent and consistent. The myths were not separate from the astronomical records. They were the astronomical records translated into narrative so that they could be memorized, retold, and transmitted without requiring the seal itself. And the Mayan Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving pre-Columbian Mayan books, contains a table of Venus observations that remains one of the most precise astronomical records from any ancient culture. The Maya tracked Venus with an accuracy that required sustained, systematic observation over many generations, and a mathematical framework sophisticated enough to predict Venus's appearances and disappearances across an 8-year cycle with an error of only 2 hours over 481 years. This was priestly knowledge, held by a specific class of trained specialists, encoded in a form that, if you did not have the key, looked like mythology. If you did have the key, it read like a scientific instrument. The priests were not decorating their temples. They were backing up their data. Around 1600 BCE, in the city of Babylon, a team of priestly astronomers began maintaining what would become one of the most important scientific documents in human history. They were not called astronomers. They were called diviners, specialists in reading the will of the gods as expressed through celestial events. Their tools were naked eyes, trained to a precision that is difficult for someone raised in an electric light civilization to fully appreciate. Their medium was clay, pressed with a stylus, baked to permanence. And over the following centuries, they accumulated an archive of Venus observations so detailed, so internally consistent, and so precisely dated that modern astronomers, 3,500 years later, used those tablets to establish the absolute chronology of Bronze Age Near Eastern history. The tablets are called the Venus tablets of Amisaduqa, and they record the first and last appearances of Venus, its risings and settings as the morning and evening star, over a period of 21 years. The observations are meticulous. They include the date of each event, the duration of the planet's visibility, the time elapsed between invisibility and reappearance, and, crucially, the omens associated with each pattern. Because in the theology of Babylon, every astronomical event carried a message. The movement of Venus was the movement of the goddess Inanna Ishtar. Her disappearance below the horizon was her descent into the underworld. Her reappearance was her resurrection. The myth and the observation were not two different texts. They were the same text, read simultaneously on two different levels. This layered reading, myth as astronomical data, data as mythological narrative, was not a primitive conflation of categories. It was a deliberate encoding strategy, developed over centuries, that served multiple purposes simultaneously. It made astronomical knowledge memorable because narrative is the most efficient known storage format for the human brain. It made it transmissible across generations without requiring literacy, because stories can be told to children. It made it resilient because a myth can survive in partial form even after the technical knowledge that generated it has been lost. The shape of the story preserves enough information for a sufficiently trained observer to reconstruct the underlying data. The stars were not metaphors for the gods. The gods were the names the ancient world gave to patterns in the sky that they had been tracking with meticulous precision for longer than written history. And the priests who maintained these observations, generation after generation, in the quiet chambers of the temple complex, were doing something that we now call science. They were measuring the universe. They were recording it. They were predicting it. And they were doing so with a level of accuracy that would not be surpassed in the Western world for another 1,000 years. What was lost when the temples fell was not mythology. It was data. In 1909, a Belgian anthropologist named Arnold van Gennep published a slim volume called Rites of Passage that would, in the following century, become one of the foundational texts of comparative anthropology. Van Gennep had noticed something that once seen could not be unseen, that across every human culture he had studied, geographically, temporally, linguistically diverse cultures with no meaningful contact with each other. The rituals that marked major life transitions followed the same three-part structure: separation from ordinary life, a period of radical disorientation, in-betweenness, the suspension of normal categories, reintegration with a new identity. He called the middle phase liminality, from the Latin limen, meaning threshold. A liminal person was someone standing in a doorway, no longer fully inside the room they had left, not yet fully inside the room they were entering. Neither one thing nor the other. Between. The great initiatory traditions of the ancient world were not simply rites of passage in the life event sense. Not like a baptism or a coming-of-age ceremony that marks a change that has already occurred. They were technologies for inducing liminality deliberately, at maximum intensity, in order to produce a specific and permanent change in the person who survived them. The ancient initiations were not marking a transformation. They were causing one. And here is why this matters, and why the neuroscience of the past 30 years has made it more comprehensible than ever before. The process of dismantling an established identity and constructing a new one requires, at the biological level, the disruption of the neural networks that encode the old self. The habits, assumptions, reflexes, and conceptual categories that constitute what we call personality are not abstract. They are physical structures in the brain, networks of connected neurons that have been strengthened by repeated activation over years. Changing them is not a matter of decision or will. It is a matter of disruption. of introducing experiences sufficiently novel, sufficiently intense, or sufficiently alien to the existing framework that the existing framework cannot simply absorb them. Something has to give. Modern trauma research has documented this process from the outside. In cases where disruption occurs without consent or preparation, producing damage rather than transformation. But the same research has identified that the crucial difference between traumatic and transformative disruption is not the intensity of the experience. It is what surrounds the experience. Preparation before, integration after, and the presence of a guide who has navigated the same territory and can be trusted. Ancient initiatory traditions, across every culture that developed them, built precisely these three conditions into their protocols. Extensive preparation, guided experience, supported reintegration. The person who emerged from the Greek mysteries was not left alone to make sense of what they had experienced. They were received into a community of initiates, people who had undergone the same journey, who could provide the context that made the experience intelligible rather than merely shattering. The Greek word that has been translated as soul, psyche, did not originally refer to the animating principle you were born with. It referred to the self that emerged from successful initiation. You were not born with a psyche. You developed one by surviving the process designed to destroy everything inessential about you. What remained afterward was what you actually were. About 14 miles west of Athens, on a wide plain near the sea, stood a sanctuary that was, for nearly 2,000 years, the most carefully kept secret in the Western world. The sanctuary at Eleusis was not hidden. It was well known, extensively visited, and central to the religious life of the ancient Mediterranean. Every year, in the autumn, a procession of thousands walked the sacred way from Athens to Eleusis, singing, carrying sacred objects, calling out the names of the deities. The roads were crowded, the preparations were public, the outer ceremonies were elaborate and visible. And then, on the final night, the initiates, those who had completed the preparatory requirements and paid the fee, and undergone the preliminary purifications, were admitted into the telesterion, the hall of initiation. The doors were closed, and whatever happened inside remained, for the better part of 2,000 years, one of the most successfully maintained secrets in the history of human civilization. We know the approximate structure of what happened. We know there was a period of fasting, that the initiates drank a specific prepared beverage called kikin before entering the telesterion, that the ceremony took place in darkness, that it lasted most of the night, and that it involved specific objects that were revealed at specific moments. Beyond this, the ancient sources, even the most articulate and least secretive writers in the classical tradition, go silent. Cicero, one of the most prolific and candid writers in Roman history, was initiated at Eleusis. He wrote about the experience only obliquely, in a passage in his work on the nature of the gods, where he says that Athens has given many excellent things to civilization, but that of all its gifts, the greatest was the mysteries, through which men were brought from a state of barbarism into genuine humanity, and through which they learned not only to live more joyfully, but to die with better hope. That is the most specific he was willing to be. Plato was initiated. His most famous philosophical constructs, the allegory of the cave, the ascent toward the light, the description of the good as something experienced rather than merely understood, read in retrospect, as philosophical translations of an experience he had undergone in that building, and could not legally, or perhaps phenomenologically, describe more directly. Then, in 1977, a book called The Road to Eleusis proposed an explanation for the Eleusinian experience that provoked controversy, generated decades of scholarly debate, and has never been entirely dismissed. Its authors were Gordon Wasson, a banker and ethnobotanist, Carl Ruck, a classics professor at Boston University, and Albert Hofmann. That last name requires emphasis. Albert Hofmann was the Swiss chemist who first synthesized LSD in 1938, who experienced its effects accidentally, and who spent the rest of his long life studying the chemistry of consciousness. He was not a fringe figure. He was the discoverer of the most studied psychedelic substance in the history of pharmacology, and his analysis of the kykeon, the drink consumed at Eleusis before the ceremony, led him to conclude that it contained a naturally occurring ergot-derived compound with properties chemically identical to the substance he had spent his life studying. The man who discovered LSD believed that the Greeks had been drinking a natural version of the same compound for 2,000 years, and that this experience was what Plato called the encounter with the good. The text that Egyptologists call the Amduat, the book of what is in the underworld, describes a journey in 12 stages, one for each hour of the Egyptian night. In each stage, the traveler encounters specific challenges, specific divine beings, specific moments of danger and resolution. At the boundary of several stages, there are gates guarded by specific entities that require specific words to pass. The knowledge of those words, the ability to speak them correctly in the proper sequence at the proper moment, is what determines whether the traveler passes through or does not. This text was found on the walls of royal tombs. That is where Egyptology encountered it. And so it was classified as funerary literature. Instructions for the dead navigating the afterlife. That interpretation is not wrong exactly, but it may not be complete, because when the architectural context of the text is examined carefully, the specific chambers in which it appears, the ritual objects found alongside it, the evidence of how those chambers were used during the lifetimes of the priests who served there. A different reading begins to emerge from the evidence. Egyptologist Jeremy Nadler, in work that has been treated with caution by mainstream Egyptology but has not been refuted, argues that the Amduat functioned simultaneously as a guide for the dead and as a performance script for the living. That certain priests, in certain chambers, in certain states of preparation, undertook the journey described in the text while still alive. Not as a metaphor, not as a visualization exercise, but as an actual, embodied ritual experience. The 12 hours of the night were literally spent in the innermost chamber, in darkness, in a physical configuration that corresponded to the text's description of the journey through the Duat. The evidence for this is circumstantial but consistent. The architectural evidence is suggestive. Inner temple chambers are designed in ways that would be senseless for purely funerary purposes, but make considerable sense as deliberate induction environments. The textual evidence is suggestive. The Amduat's language, on close reading, is not exclusively third-person narrative about the dead. At several junctures, it shifts to second person, speaking directly to the person undergoing the journey. And then there is the sarcophagus in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid. It has no lid. It has no inscriptions. It was built into the structure during construction. It is larger than the entrance passage. and could not have been brought in afterward. There is no mummy, no funerary equipment, no evidence that it was ever used for the purpose that the word sarcophagus implies. Egyptian archaeologists have been offering explanations for this since Napoleon's scholars first measured it in 1798. None of those explanations have achieved consensus. The most straightforward reading, that it was not a burial device, remains the one that mainstream archaeology has found hardest to accept. In the autumn of 1817, Giovanni Battista Belzoni entered the second pyramid at Giza. He was a former circus strongman turned antiquities explorer. 6 feet 3 inches tall, physically enormous, driven by a combination of genuine curiosity and commercial ambition that was typical of the era. He had already shipped several massive Egyptian artifacts back to Europe. He was, by any measure, a remarkable individual. And when he pushed through the blocked entrance of Khafra's pyramid and became one of the first modern people to enter a chamber that had been sealed for thousands of years, he was capable of recognizing the significance of what he was doing. His published account of the experience is detailed, vivid, and, on close reading, slightly strange. He describes the physical features of the chambers with precision, dimensions, material, orientation. He describes the central chamber and the empty red granite sarcophagus within it. He describes the smell, the darkness, the temperature. What he does not describe, with any comparable precision, is the contents of the chamber beyond its architectural elements. A handful of bones, some dust. Nothing of ritual significance. No small objects, no organic residue, no material that would have told him what the room had actually been used for. Was there nothing to describe? Possibly. 3,000 years of occasional unofficial intrusion would have removed most portable objects long before Belzoni arrived. But the pattern in his account, comprehensive on architecture, sparse on organic and small-scale material evidence, anticipates a pattern that would appear repeatedly over the following 2 centuries of Egyptian archaeology. The large and tone and structural was documented exhaustively. The small and organic and chemically significant was documented minimally or not at all. In 1922, Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun, the most complete pharaonic burial ever discovered, with thousands of objects preserved under extraordinary conditions. The excavation took 10 years. The photographic and written documentation was, by the standards of its time, excellent. And yet Carter's private diaries, which were never fully published in his lifetime and which researchers have been studying in fragments ever since, contain entries that describe objects and observations not included in the official excavation reports. The discrepancies are not enormous. They do not point toward a dramatic conspiracy. They point towards something more mundane and more pervasive. The selective filtering that occurs when information passes through people with specific training, specific assumptions, and specific professional interests. Carter was trained to see artifacts, objects with form, material, and iconographic significance. He was less trained to see residues, traces, and chemical evidence. The questions his discipline asked were not the questions that would have led him to document the organic material in the laboratory spaces of the temple storage rooms with the same care he applied to the gilded furniture. This is not deception. It is the limitation of any paradigm. But the consequence is that our understanding of what actually happened inside ancient sacred chambers has been significantly shaped by what the first generation of scientific archaeology was equipped to see. The researchers who found cannabis in the incense burners at Tel Arad did not set out to find cannabis. They set out to perform routine archaeological chemistry on residue samples from a well-documented Judean sanctuary. The cannabis, high THC variety, mixed with frankincense, emerged from the chromatographic analysis as a simple chemical fact. It was there. The incense burners were there. The sanctuary context was documented, and the implication was unavoidable. In this particular sacred space, in the 8th century BCE, the people performing ritual were breathing psychoactive smoke. The researchers published in a peer-reviewed journal. The finding was covered briefly in popular science media, and then it was largely returned to the category of interesting archaeological footnote rather than the category of world historical revelation that, when placed in its proper context, it actually represents. Because Tel Arad is not an isolated case, it is one point in a pattern that, when mapped globally and chronologically, produces a picture so consistent that the word intentional becomes difficult to avoid. At Mas Castelar de Pontos in northern Spain, a ritual sanctuary dating to the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE yielded plant remains that included cannabis achenes, seeds. In association with ritual objects in a ceremonial context. The site's excavators noted the association. The finding received limited attention. At the Jirzankal Cemetery, in the Pamir Mountains of western China, dating to approximately 500 BCE, the charred residue in wooden braziers tested positive for high THC cannabis in a funerary and ritual context. The individuals buried at the site had been traveling, the broader archaeological picture suggests, on the ancient routes that would eventually become the Silk Road. They were bringing the practice with them. In the Bronze Age Cycladic site of Kiros, ritual vessels analyzed in recent years have produced residue consistent with opium-related compounds. In Bronze Age Cyprus, specific ceramics shaped to resemble opium poppy seed pods have been found in contexts suggesting ritual rather than medical use. In the Andes, coca leaves, which contain the alkaloid cocaine in natural form, appear in ritual contexts dating back at least 4,000 years, consistently associated with the priestly and shamanic roles that managed the boundary between ordinary and extraordinary experience. The pattern is this. In every major ancient civilization for which adequate organic evidence has survived and been analyzed with modern chemical methods, there is evidence of the deliberate use of consciousness-altering plant compounds in ritual contexts. The evidence is not marginal. It is consistent across geography and time to a degree that makes the word coincidence inadequate. And the consistent feature of every case is that the compounds were not used casually, recreationally, or by anyone who wished to use them. They were used in specific spaces, at specific times, by specific individuals, following protocols that had been refined over generations to produce specific, predictable results. The ancient ritual specialists were not experimenting blindly with drugs. They were applying pharmacological knowledge as sophisticated, within its own framework, as anything the modern world has developed in the past century. When the first European archaeologists encountered the category of object they called a ritual object, they created, without fully intending to, one of the most useful and most intellectually limiting categories in the history of the discipline. A ritual object was functionally an object whose purpose was not understood. if an excavator could not determine what a recovered item was used for. The default classification was ceremonial, votive, symbolic, associated with religious practice. The category was a placeholder for ignorance, and it was used with great frequency. Betyl stones appear across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean in contexts that consistently suggest sacred significance. They were kept in inner temple chambers. They were anointed with oil. They were addressed in prayer. They were transported under conditions of elaborate care and ritual protection. Ancient sources describe them as possessing divine presence. Modern archaeologists classified them as cult objects and moved on. More recently, mineralogical analysis of several betyl specimens has confirmed something the ancient sources suggested. Many of them are meteoritic iron, a material that fell from space with a composition and electromagnetic signature unlike any terrestrial stone. Modern instruments placed near authenticated meteoritic betyls produce measurable, anomalous electromagnetic readings. The priests who kept these objects in their innermost chambers were not worshipping rocks. They were keeping objects that behaved differently from any naturally occurring terrestrial material. Objects that, in an era before any understanding of electromagnetism, would have been experienced as genuinely mysterious in a way that was entirely real, not imagined. Then there are the curved bronze discs. Hundreds of them have been found across the ancient Mediterranean, in contexts ranging from Greek sanctuaries to Roman villa storage rooms to Egyptian temple deposits. They were labeled mirrors, filed under personal grooming objects or votive offerings. Occasionally, they appear in museum cases with a note suggesting their association with divine feminine symbolism. An acoustic engineer working on an unrelated project encountered a photograph of one of these discs and noticed something that no archaeologist had apparently tested. The geometry of the disc was consistent with a parabolic reflector, a shape that focuses sound waves to a specific point in space. He tested a replica. The results were extraordinary. A person standing at the focal point of a bronze parabolic reflector of the appropriate dimensions can hear a whisper clearly from 50 meters away. A voice produced near the surface of the disc arrives at the focal point amplified and directional, stripped of the diffusion that normally makes sound lose coherence with distance. In a temple environment, with appropriate acoustic staging, such a device could make a voice appear to originate from inside a closed statue. It could make sound arrive without visible source. It could create, for an unprepared person standing at the focal point, an experience of receiving words from an invisible presence. The priests were not looking at their reflections. They were building precision acoustic instruments. And nobody noticed for 150 years of professional archaeology. In 1947, a workman repairing plumbing at a Roman villa in the Pompeian hinterland broke through a wall and found a room that had been sealed by volcanic ash since 79 CE. The room was not large, but its walls, from floor to ceiling, were covered in paintings. Not decorative paintings, narrative paintings. A sequence of scenes that moved around the room in a specific order, depicting what appeared to be a ceremony of some kind, involving multiple figures in various states of preparation, ritual action, and emotional intensity. One panel was badly damaged. Several others were vivid and precise. The last panel showed a woman in a state of composure so complete it seemed, to later observers, to read as either transcendence or relief. The Villa of the Mysteries, as it came to be called, is the most complete surviving visual record of an ancient initiation rite. Scholars have debated for decades which specific mystery tradition it depicts. The debate has not been resolved, but several things about the sequence are clear and consistent across interpretations. The figure who enters the ceremony in the first panel is not the same figure who appears in the final panel. Not in terms of emotional state, not in terms of physical posture, not in terms of relationship to the other figures. Something has happened between the beginning and the end of the sequence. Something that involved ritual objects, ritual substances, specific sounds and gestures, and periods of apparently intense experience. Something that left the central figure transformed in a way that the painter chose to render as a quality of settled, serious, permanent calm. Beneath the Pyramid of the Moon at Teotihuacan, excavations completed in 2004 reached the lowest of a series of chambers that had been sealed since the 3rd century of the Common Era. Inside, researchers found offerings arranged with evident cosmological intentionality. Specific animals in specific positions, obsidian objects of specific types, human remains that suggested not simple sacrifice, but the interment of individuals who occupied a specific role in the ritual system. The arrangement of the offerings corresponded to the 4 cardinal directions, to specific Mesoamerican cosmological principles, to a theological framework that the surface architecture of the pyramid had been encoding in 3-dimensional form for 1500 years. And in excavations of Egyptian temple storage rooms, the spaces adjacent to the innermost sanctuaries, researchers have consistently found evidence of what can only be described as production facilities. Stone vessels for the grinding and mixing of specific plant compounds, residue consistent with aromatic preparations of considerable sophistication, storage jars that held, when analyzed, compound mixtures of medicinal and psychoactive substances that would have required significant specialized knowledge to prepare. The forbidden rooms contained what you would expect them to contain, if you understood what the priests were actually doing. The materials and tools of applied pharmacology, applied acoustics, applied astronomy, and applied psychology. Not the paraphernalia of superstition, the equipment of a working laboratory. The Vedic texts describe a drink called soma with an insistence that borders on obsession. More than 100 hymns in the Rig Veda are addressed directly to soma, to the plant, to the drink prepared from it, to the god who is simultaneously embodied by it. The hymns describe its taste, its color, its effects on the body and the mind, its relationship to immortality, to divine vision, to the direct perception of truth. They describe the experience of drinking it as an encounter with something that ordinary language was not designed to hold. Every attempt at description runs up against the same boundary. The thing itself is more than the words. For centuries, scholars assumed soma was a lost plant, identified and named in the texts, but no longer in ritual use, the knowledge of its identity preserved, but the practice discontinued. Then the ethnobotanical research of the past 50 years began accumulating evidence that raised a different question. What if the practice had not been discontinued, but had simply not been fully examined? The candidates proposed by researchers include Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric mushroom with its well-documented psychoactive properties, Syrian rue combined with ephedra, and several species of psilocybin-containing mushrooms documented in the regions where the early Vedic traditions developed. No consensus has emerged. But the one thing every serious researcher in this field agrees on is this: Soma was a real substance with real pharmacological effects. The hymns are too specific, too consistent, too physiologically accurate to be describing something imaginary. In Egypt, the blue lotus, Nymphaea caerulea, appears in ritual iconography with a frequency that cannot be explained decoratively. Figures in relief carvings hold it, inhale it directly, soak it in wine before drinking. Modern pharmacological analysis of the lotus has confirmed the presence of aporphine alkaloids with mild psychoactive and anxiolytic properties, and nuciferine, which interacts with serotonin receptors in ways consistent with mild mood alteration and enhanced sensory awareness. The frequency of the lotus in ritual contexts, combined with its documented chemistry, makes the conclusion that it was used intentionally as a consciousness-altering agent nearly unavoidable. In Central America, carved stone mushroom figures, some of the most distinctive objects in Mesoamerican archaeological collections, date to at least 1500 BCE and appear in contexts that consistently associate them with ritual practice and priestly authority. The Madrid Codex, one of the 4 surviving Mayan books, contains references to mushrooms in ritual contexts that specialists in the field have interpreted as documenting their ceremonial use. The Aztec name for psilocybin mushrooms, Teonanacal, meaning flesh of the gods, was documented by the Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún in the 16th century, along with his account of how the Aztec priests used them in the ceremony. He found it alarming. It was, by any clinical measure, sophisticated. The San Pedro cactus of the Andes, containing the mescaline alkaloids that modern medicine is currently evaluating as a treatment for addiction and depression, appears in Peruvian iconography dating to 1300 BCE in contexts associated with healing, divination, and priestly authority. Across 5 continents and 4,000 years, the same pattern holds. Specific substances, prepared in specific ways, administered in specific contexts or to specific individuals for specific purposes. What changed between then and now is not the chemistry. It is the institutional context. In 2001, a Dutch cardiologist named Pim van Lommel published a paper in The Lancet, one of the world's most respected medical journals, that described the results of the largest prospective study of near-death experiences ever conducted. Over 10 years, he and his team had followed 344 cardiac arrest patients who had been successfully resuscitated, interviewing them about their subjective experiences during the period of clinical death. 18% reported clear, detailed, verifiable memories from that period. 4% reported experiences of profound intensity. The experiences described by these individuals, separated by age, nationality, educational background, religious belief, and personality, shared a structural consistency that Van Lommel found impossible to dismiss as coincidence or individual psychology. The sense of leaving the body and observing it from outside, the movement through a transitional space toward a source of light or warmth, encounters with deceased relatives or other presences, a review of the life just lived, experienced as simultaneous rather than sequential, a threshold, a boundary that, once crossed, would mean the experience could not end in return. And then the return itself, accompanied by specific and lasting changes, a reduction of the fear of death, an expansion of compassion, an increased sense of connection to other people, and a persistent certainty about the meaning and value of existence that survivors described as more vivid and more real than any previous experience. Van Lommel published his findings. He noted with the scholar's care that the experiences reported by his cardiac patients shared structural features with ancient accounts of visionary experience that he had not initially been looking for. He found echoes in the Egyptian Amduat, in the Tibetan Bardo Thodol, in the Orphic gold tablets, small gold leaves found in Greek burial contexts dating to the 4th century BCE, inscribed with instructions for the soul navigating the post-death transition. The instructions on the tablets were not vague spiritual consolations, they were specific. Turn left at the cypress. Do not drink from the first spring. Identify yourself by name to the guardians at the gate. The tablets read, in retrospect, as travel guides to a territory that someone had actually visited. The most straightforward interpretation of this convergence. Ancient accounts of structured post-death experience and modern clinical accounts of structured near-death experience as exhibiting the same structural features, is that both are describing the same phenomenon. The question of what that phenomenon is remains open. But the question of whether ancient priests had encountered it and developed systematic frameworks for navigating it is substantially less open. They clearly had. The evidence is in the texts, in the architectural preparation of the ritual environments, and in the consistent testimonies of the people who underwent the experiences those environments were designed to produce. The territory beyond the threshold is not a theological abstraction. It is a place that human beings have been visiting and returning from, and trying to describe for as long as there have been human beings. The ancient priests knew the path. They had drawn maps, and they had built chambers specifically designed to bring the traveler to the edge of the threshold and back. The oracle at Delphi did not see the future. This is the correct understanding, and it is also almost entirely missing the point. What the oracle at Delphi did was something considerably more interesting and considerably more applicable to the real world than supernatural foreknowledge. What Delphi did was gather intelligence, synthesize it, and deliver it in a form that its recipients were obligated, by religious belief, social custom, and the evidence of its track record, to take seriously. Consider the logistics. Every year, for nearly 1,000 years, delegations from city-states, kingdoms, and empires across the Mediterranean world traveled to Delphi to consult the oracle. Each delegation brought gifts. Each delegation also brought, in the course of the consultation process, the preliminary purifications, the waiting periods, the interactions with the sanctuary priests who managed the visit, detailed information about their home situation, the state of the harvest, the condition of the military, the internal politics of the ruling class, the intentions of neighboring powers. Delphi was, in effect, the most consistently visited and most generously supplied intelligence-gathering operation in the ancient world. Operating continuously for a millennium, the priests who managed these visits were not passive recipients of this information. They were trained observers with decades of experience interpreting the political and military landscape of a wide geographic area. When a delegation from Lydia arrived asking whether King Croesus should go to war with Persia, the priests of Delphi had access to information from Persian delegations, from Greek city-states with Persian connections, from merchants who moved between the two empires, and from their own long-term tracking of the political trajectory of both powers. The famous response to Croesus, "If you cross the river, a great empire will be destroyed," has been ridiculed for centuries as the ultimate example of oracular evasiveness. But from a geopolitical analysis perspective, it was precise. Croesus was overextended, operating with insufficient knowledge of Persian military capacity and making strategic decisions based on an overestimation of his own strength. Any careful analyst of the situation would have reached the same conclusion. This military adventure had a high probability of ending badly. The oracle was not hedging, it was correct. The role of the Pythia herself, the woman who sat above the geological vent and delivered the divine words, was genuine and not merely theatrical. The ethylene exposure, the extended fasting and purification that preceded each consultation, the months of training in the interpretation of the symbolic language used to frame oracular responses. These were real preparations that produced real alterations in the quality of her cognitive processing. She was not performing prophecy. She was performing a specific kind of synthesized cognition, drawing on information she had absorbed in a state of consciousness that was chemically, physiologically, and architecturally different from ordinary awareness, and arriving at outputs that no committee of advisors could have predicted she would produce. This is what the priests understood about the oracle that her clients, kneeling before her, did not, that the system worked. Not because gods were speaking, because the system itself was brilliantly designed. The ancient texts are not uniformly celebratory about what happened in the inner chambers. Alongside the accounts of transformation and divine encounter, there is another category of record, quieter, less frequently cited, more uncomfortable, that describes what happened when the system failed, when the preparation was insufficient, when the dosing was incorrect, when the person who entered was not, despite all appearances, ready. In the Vedic medical texts, there is a condition described with enough specificity to suggest that the compilers had observed it repeatedly, a state they called a form of soma excess, producing symptoms that would be clinically recognizable today as dissociative psychosis, inability to recognize familiar people or places, confusion of past and present, belief that one was still in the ritual state long after the ceremony had ended, loss of ordinary social and emotional coherence. The texts describe this condition with clinical precision and with considerable seriousness, because it was not a theoretical possibility. It happened, and the management of it required specific intervention. Ritual regrounding procedures, community support, the physical presence of a skilled senior practitioner who had the authority and the knowledge to guide the affected person back. At Delphi, ancient sources record multiple instances of Pythii who delivered confused, incoherent, or physically disturbing oracular performances. Several of these accounts describe the affected woman dying shortly after the consultation, a detail that modern researchers have associated with the physiological effects of chronic ethylene exposure in a person whose body was already stressed by the prolonged fasting and physical deprivation required by the consultative protocols. The system worked for many. For some, it extracted a cost that could not be returned. Among the Aztec priestly class, the most extreme fasting and bloodletting rituals, the ones performed at the major calendar ceremonies, produced documented cases of what the Spanish observers, writing several decades after the conquest, described as divine possession states that the priests themselves appeared unable to terminate. Modern observers would use a different vocabulary. acute dissociative states, possibly complicated by blood loss, dehydration, and the cumulative physiological effects of months of ritual preparation. Ancient Aztec sources acknowledge that some priests who undertook the most extreme preparations required extended periods of community care to return to ordinary function. Others, apparently, did not fully return. The ancient priestly traditions knew about these failures. They documented them. They built their training protocols partly around preventing them. The preparation was not just spiritual readiness. It was physical and psychological screening, designed to identify the people who could approach the edge without going over it. That some still went over it is not a condemnation of the system. It is evidence that the system was real, and that the edge it was approaching was real. You cannot go over the edge of something that does not exist. On a summer morning in the year 60 of the Common Era, the Roman general Suetonius Paulinus stood on the shore of the Menai Strait in Wales and looked across the water at the island of Anglesey. On the opposite bank, a crowd had gathered. Warriors in formation, and among them, in black robes, the Druids. The Roman accounts describe the scene in terms that suggest even the battle-hardened legionaries felt something unfamiliar as they prepared to cross. The Druids, the accounts say, moved among the warriors calling on their gods with raised hands, their cries mixing with the sound of the water. The Romans crossed, they fought, they won. And when the battle was over, Suetonius ordered the destruction of every sacred grove on the island. His soldiers, the historian Tacitus wrote, cut down the groves dedicated to savage rites, because the Druids considered it their duty to drench their altars with the blood of prisoners, and to consult the gods by means of human entrails. Tacitus was Roman. He was writing within a specific rhetorical tradition that consistently described the religious practices of conquered peoples in the most unflattering possible terms. But the trees burned regardless, and the Druidic community, that had maintained an unbroken oral archive for centuries, was reduced, in a single morning, to a remnant. This is what the end of an ancient priestly tradition actually looks like. Not a gradual fade. A specific moment, a specific act of destruction, carried out by specific people for specific political reasons. And then silence, where there had been transmission. In 1562, on the Yucatan Peninsula, the Franciscan friar Diego de Landa gathered every Mayan book he could find and burned them. He recorded the event in his own diary, noting that the indigenous people cried with great grief. He destroyed, in that act, everything except 4 surviving Mayan codices that had already reached Europe. The entirety of Mayan written knowledge. The astronomical records, the ritual calendars, the historical chronicles, the medical texts, the theological commentaries, was reduced to ash over the course of an afternoon. Landa later wrote his own account of Mayan culture, which remains one of our primary sources on the subject. He described what he had destroyed, from memory, based on what people had told him before he burned it. The Library of Alexandria receives the most historical attention of any ancient knowledge catastrophe. But it was one instance in a global pattern. The systematic destruction of the institutions and the people who maintained the most sophisticated knowledge traditions the ancient world possessed. The pattern is consistent. The mechanism is consistent. The people with power over other people's lives consistently found, in the priestly tradition, something that was either a rival to their authority or an affront to their beliefs. and they acted accordingly. What survived did so by accident, by geography, by the deliberate decision of specific people to hide specific things, or by the inherent resilience of oral transmission. The question is what survived and where. Around 300 CE, as the Christian Roman Empire was systematically closing the last active temples of the ancient world, a Syrian-born philosopher named Iamblichus was writing a comprehensive defense of the Egyptian theurgic tradition. His work, known as On the Mysteries, is one of the strangest and most important books produced in the ancient world's final centuries. A systematic, philosophically sophisticated account of why the ritual practices of ancient Egyptian priesthood were valid, coherent, and necessary, written in the language and conceptual framework of Greek philosophy, addressed to an audience that was increasingly hostile to the practices it described. Iamblichus was not nostalgic. He was strategic. By translating the experiential and theological claims of the Egyptian tradition into the vocabulary of Platonic philosophy, a vocabulary that the educated Roman world still respected, even as it moved toward Christian theology. He created a form of the knowledge that could survive the closure of the temples. Not the practice itself, but the intellectual framework of the practice. The understanding of what the practice was for, what it was doing, and why it worked. That framework passed through the Neoplatonic philosophical tradition into the Islamic Golden Age, and from there back into European thought during the Renaissance. The alchemical tradition that appears in medieval Europe is usually described as an early and failed attempt at chemistry, a misguided effort to transform base metals into gold, pursued by people who did not understand what chemistry was. This is the most superficial possible reading of the material. Medieval alchemists were not primarily interested in metallurgy. The gold they sought was not a physical substance. Paracelsus, one of the most brilliant and most frequently misread minds of the 16th century, wrote this in terms that were explicit enough to be clear to anyone reading carefully. The true gold of alchemy was produced not in a furnace but in the practitioner. The stages of the alchemical process, nigredo, blackening, dissolution, albedo, whitening, purification, rubedo, reddening, completion, map directly, and with striking precision, onto the structural sequence of ancient initiatory experience. Dissolution is the destruction of the old self in the initiatory ordeal. Purification is the liminal period between identities. The completed gold is the transformed self that emerges. This was not reading modern meaning into ancient text. The alchemists said this explicitly, in language that their contemporaries understood because they shared the reference points. The alchemical tradition was not a failed science. It was a continuation, in disguise, of a much older practice, the ancient technology of deliberate human transformation, encoded in chemical metaphor, precisely because chemical metaphor was the one intellectual framework that the medieval church had not yet systematically suppressed. The knowledge changed its clothes. It survived by becoming unrecognizable to the people who would have destroyed it if they had recognized it. This is the underground stream, the continuous, unbroken thread of transmission that connects the innermost chambers of the ancient world to the present, running beneath the surface of official history, occasionally surfacing in unexpected places, in unexpected forms. In the state of Kerala in southern India, there is a form of theatre that has been performed continuously for at least 2,000 years. Kudiyatam, recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, is performed by members of specific castes whose families have maintained the tradition across many generations, with a rigidity of transmission that would be recognizable to any ancient Vedic teacher. The gestures, the vocal techniques, the specific movements of the eyes codified in a system of over 600 distinct eye movements. The timing, the relationship between performer and sacred text. All of this has been passed from teacher to student in an unbroken chain that makes the tradition simultaneously ancient and alive. Scholars who have studied Kudiyatam in relation to Vedic ritual performance have identified specific elements that appear to derive directly from practices described in Vedic ritual texts, dating to the first millennium BCE. The continuity is not claimed on the basis of faith. It is demonstrated on the basis of documented correspondences. The tradition is old, and it is still here. In Iran, in small communities in Gujarat, India, and scattered elsewhere across the world. The Zoroastrian priestly tradition. The descendants of the Magi, the Persian priestly class that appears in the Greek sources, in the New Testament, in the history of every empire that bordered the ancient Persian world, continues to tend its fires and maintain its liturgical practices with a dedication that has survived 14 centuries of Islamic rule, Mongol invasion, and diaspora. Their numbers are small. Their knowledge, as with every living oral tradition, is not entirely transferable in text. But it is alive, and then there is something that does not look like an ancient priestly tradition at all because it is dressed in the language of clinical medicine and neuroscience and peer-reviewed research. The contemporary movement in psychedelic-assisted therapy, centered in institutions like Johns Hopkins, NYU, Imperial College London, and the MAPS organization, is producing results that mainstream psychiatry is finding increasingly difficult to ignore. Psilocybin for depression and end-of-life anxiety. MDMA for post-traumatic stress. Ketamine for treatment-resistant mood disorders. The mechanisms of action are being studied, documented, and refined. But the structural features of the therapeutic protocols that produce the best outcomes are strikingly consistent with the structural features of ancient initiatory practice. Extended preparation with a trained guide, a carefully designed environment, a supported period of intense experience, and a community of peers who can help the individual integrate what they encountered. The researchers designing these protocols mostly did not draw on ancient priestly literature. They arrived at the same structure through clinical trial and error. The ancient priests would not have been surprised. They had run the same trial for a longer time, and they had reached the same conclusions. There is a tendency in writing about lost ancient knowledge to be either romantically despairing or naively optimistic. The romantic view holds that the ancient world possessed wisdom so profound and so complete that everything since its destruction has been a long decline. That the priests of Egypt or the Druids of Gaul or the Brahmins of the Vedic period knew things we can now only dimly guess at, and that the loss is irreparable. The naively optimistic view holds that everything worth knowing can eventually be reconstructed from the fragments that survive, and that the tools of modern science will eventually close every gap. Both views miss something important. Some things are genuinely lost. The specific oral dimension of the Druidic tradition, not just the content, but the living quality of its transmission. The way knowledge changes when it is passed from a human being who has embodied it to a human being who is learning to embody it, cannot be reconstructed from archaeological evidence or fragmentary medieval texts. The precise experiential content of the Eleusinian mysteries is not knowable from the outside. The specific compounds used in specific ritual preparations, in the exact proportions and methods developed over centuries of refinement, are mostly one. The loss is real, and it is permanent, and it is large. But here is what is not lost: the human nervous system. The brain that ancient priests were working with is the same brain that exists in every person alive today. The effects they were producing, the alterations in consciousness, the loosening of the boundary between self and world, the access to states of awareness that ordinary daily life does not provide, are not lost because they were never in an external location to begin with. They were always in the architecture of human consciousness. The practices were technologies for accessing what was already there. And technologies, unlike the specific knowledge traditions that develop them, can be redeveloped. This is what the ethnobotanists, who spend their careers in remote communities, documenting the plant knowledge of elders before it is lost, understand with great clarity. They are in a race, not to preserve artifacts, but to preserve living knowledge. Knowledge that exists only in the bodies and minds of specific people who learned it in specific ways, and that will vanish completely when those people die. Some of that race is being lost. Some of it, barely, is being won. And in the laboratories, where neuroscientists are mapping the neural correlates of mystical experience, and in the clinics where psychedelic-assisted therapy is producing transformations that antidepressants and talk therapy could not, something else is happening. The modern world is beginning, slowly, tentatively, with considerable institutional resistance, to rediscover what the ancient priest knew. Not by remembering it, by finding it again, through the same empirical method the priests themselves used. Careful observation, systematic application, an honest documentation of what actually happens to the human mind when you approach it in the right way. We began with a sealed door. We have spent every chapter since asking what was behind it. Through the architecture, through the chemistry, through the training and selection of the priests, through the rituals, through the archaeological evidence, through the initiatory experiences, through the survival of fragments into the modern world. And now, finally, we are in a position to look at everything we have gathered and ask the question that all of it has been circling. What was the one thing? Because there was a one thing across 6 civilizations, across 40 centuries, across every geographic and cultural variation in the specific practices involved. The ancient priestly traditions converge on a single point. Not a specific piece of astronomical data, not a specific chemical formula, not a specific piece of historical fact that powerful people wanted to conceal. Something at once simpler and more consequential than any of those. What the ancient priestly traditions were protecting, transmitting, and ultimately embodying was an answer to the question that every human being, in every culture, at every point in history, regardless of education, language, class, or belief, eventually faces. Usually in the quiet moments. Usually when the ordinary business of survival has, for a moment, stopped demanding attention. The question that arrives at 3 in the morning, or at the bedside of someone dying, or in the stillness after a great loss. Is there something more than this? The priest's answer, arrived at through thousands of years of deliberate, systematic, empirically careful investigation into the extreme edges of human consciousness, was not a theological claim. it was something more precise and more interesting than that. It was a report. A consistent, cross-cultural, trans-historical report that said yes, and not merely yes in a vague, comforting sense, but yes with specifics, yes with a structure, yes with a geography, however impassable that geography there is to map in ordinary language. The direct experience of something beyond ordinary consciousness is not, the ancient priests concluded, a matter of faith. It is a matter of access. And access could be taught. The sealed chambers were not where gods lived. They were where the technology of access was developed, refined, tested, and transmitted. The priests were not intercessors between humanity and an invisible divine realm. They were, in their own precise and carefully chosen language, guides, people who had made the journey, who knew the terrain, who had developed reliable methods for bringing others to the threshold and back. The secret at the center of every ancient sacred tradition was not information about the world. It was information about the mind, but Ziggurat. Specifically, about what the mind becomes when you strip away everything that is not essential to it. This is what they were hiding, not from their enemies, for their successors. In 1962, a psychologist named Walter Panker administered psilocybin to 20 seminary students in a Boston chapel on Good Friday. Half the students received the compound, half received a placebo. The students who received psilocybin reported, at significantly higher rates than the control group, experiences characterized by a specific constellation of features, a sense of unity, the dissolution of the boundary between self and world, a noetic quality, the conviction that something genuinely important, something that felt like knowledge, was being directly perceived, a sense of sacredness, deeply positive affect, a transcendence of ordinary time and space, and ineffability, the inability to convey the experience in ordinary language. 25 years later, a follow-up study interviewed the same participants. The experiences from that single session remained, for the group that had received psilocybin, among the most significant of their lives. They had integrated what had happened into their understanding of themselves, their relationships, and their sense of meaning in ways that persisted across decades. They had not become different people in a destabilizing sense. They had become more fully themselves, or at least more aligned with what they felt themselves essentially to be. What Panker observed in 1962 was identified, named, and catalogued with greater precision over the following decades by researchers at institutions including Johns Hopkins University, where Roland Griffiths and his team conducted a series of landmark studies beginning in 2006. Their findings were consistent with Panker's. The specific cluster of experiential features that Griffiths' team called the mystical experience could be reliably produced in appropriately prepared subjects under appropriately managed conditions. And the outcome measures, the actual changes in well-being, behavior, and outlook that persisted after the session, were among the most robust that psychiatric research had ever documented. Meanwhile, a neuroscientist named Andrew Newberg was placing monks, nuns, and long-term meditators in brain scanners during peak states of spiritual practice. What he found was consistent and specific. During the moments that subjects described as most profound, the moments of unity, of transcendence, of contact with something larger than the individual self, a specific region of the brain showed a marked decrease in activity. The parietal lobe, the region responsible for maintaining the sense of the body's location in space, the processing of boundaries between self and environment, the construction of the individual self as a bounded entity in a bounded world. When that region went quiet, the sense of a bounded individual self went quiet with it. What remained was described by meditators, mystics, near-death survivors, and psilocybin subjects in remarkably similar terms. The ancient priests had a theological description of this experience. They called it union with the divine, entry into the duat, dissolution into Brahman, merging with the sacred fire. Modern neuroscience has a biological description. They are describing the same event. The ancient practitioners did not have a brain scanner, but they had something the researchers did not. 3,000 years of experience guiding people to that place and back. For the past several centuries, the dominant Western intellectual tradition has operated with a specific understanding of ancient religion, that it was primitive, a stage in the development of human thought that preceded and was replaced by rational inquiry, that expressed in narrative and ritual form the early attempts of frightened, limited beings to explain a frightening, incomprehensible world. Mythology was proto-science, ritual was proto-medicine, prayer was proto-psychology. All of it was pointing, fumblingly, in the direction of what eventually, through the long discipline of rationalism, we actually arrived at. This view is understandable. It is also, as the evidence accumulated across this documentary suggests, substantially wrong. What the ancient priestly traditions were doing was not proto-anything. It was a complete, sophisticated, empirically grounded discipline in its own right. One that happened to be organized around different questions than modern science, conducted in different institutional settings, expressed in different vocabulary, and aimed at different outcomes. The differences are real and significant, but the differences do not make the ancient discipline primitive. They make it different. And the most consequential difference is that the ancient priestly disciplines were organized around a category of investigation that modern science has only recently begun to take seriously as a legitimate field of inquiry: the systematic study of human consciousness and its potential extremes. What does this mean for how we understand history? It means that the standard story, in which human beings began with superstition and gradually developed knowledge, is not false exactly, but is missing an entire dimension of what was happening. Alongside the development of technology, governance, and empirical science, there was a parallel development of something that could be called the science of the interior. The systematic, disciplined, empirically tested investigation of what the human mind is capable of perceiving and experiencing when approached in specific ways. This parallel development was conducted by the priestly traditions. It was the thing most carefully protected behind the sealed doors, and its systematic suppression, by conquest, by religious intolerance, by the narrowing of permissible inquiry that accompanied the rise of certain institutional forms of both religion and science, represents a loss that the modern world is only beginning to take the measure of. The second large implication is pharmacological. The accumulating evidence that ancient priestly traditions worldwide use specific plant compounds as tools for producing specific states of consciousness. With sophistication, with care, with protocols refined over centuries, fundamentally reframes the contemporary conversation about psychedelic medicine. The clinical researchers working with psilocybin and MDMA today are not doing something unprecedented. They are doing something that was preceded by thousands of years of empirical investigation. The ancient practitioners would recognize the protocols, recognize the goals, and recognize the outcomes. The vocabulary has changed. The essential practice has not. What we thought was primitive turns out to be sophisticated. What we thought was superstition turns out to be empiricism. What we thought was lost turns out to be waiting, in the architecture of the human brain, to be rediscovered. Every ancient initiatory tradition that we have studied across these chapters agrees on one thing. Not on the specific content of what was experienced inside the sealed chamber. Not on the name of the deity encountered or the precise nature of the knowledge received. On one thing only. The person who came back was not the same person who went in. This is not a vague or poetic claim. The ancient sources are specific about the changes. They describe them in terms that are consistent across cultures and centuries and would be, with appropriate vocabulary adjustment, recognizable to any contemporary clinician who has worked extensively with people recovering from significant psychological transformation. The fear of death, reliably and consistently reduced. Not managed, not suppressed, but genuinely reconfigured, as if the thing being feared had been examined at close range and found to be not what it appeared. The sense of individual identity, permanently loosened from its previous rigidity. Not dissolved, not lost, but enlarged, made more flexible, less defended. The experience of connection to other people and to the world significantly intensified. An equality of knowledge. Not factual knowledge, not knowledge of specific propositions, but something more like certainty, of a kind that cannot be argued away, because it was not arrived at through argument. The ancient texts that attempt to describe what initiates came back, knowing share a common frustration. They keep reaching the same boundary. The most profound thing that was encountered inside the chamber, the thing that made generals weep and philosophers fall silent, and ordinary people emerge from the telesterion and spend the rest of their lives saying that everything before that night had been preparation, cannot be fully transmitted in language. It can be pointed at. It can be prepared for. It can be invited. It cannot be described. And yet the consequences of the encounter can be described. They were described across 40 centuries and 6 civilizations, with remarkable consistency. The person who returned from the deepest initiatory experience had encountered something that permanently altered their relationship to the basic facts of human existence. They were still human. They still ate and slept and died and suffered and loved and made mistakes. But their orientation toward all of these things had changed, because they had been shown, not told, shown through direct encounter in the conditions that the ancient world spent enormous resources creating and protecting, that the boundaries they had assumed were absolute were not, that the self they had assumed was the whole of what they were was only part of it, that the fear that organized so much of ordinary human experience was based on a misunderstanding about what was actually happening. This is what was behind the sealed door. Not a secret about history, not a suppressed technology, not a conspiracy of the powerful against the powerless. Something quieter than any of those things. Something that the most carefully prepared human beings in history spent their lives approaching and describing in the only language available, and passing forward to the next generation of people willing to cross the threshold. The door has been sealed again. It is always being sealed again. But the door is not the destination. The destination is what happens when you are willing to stop at the threshold and listen to what the silence inside is trying to say.